The sky over Dry Creek County wore the afternoon like a blue enamel bowl tipped toward the horizon. Sun pouring down in a steady spill that turned every fence wire into a bright string and every shard of bottle glass along the ditch into a star. Out on County Road 17, the heat rippled low over the blacktop, and the only shade came from telephone poles that took turns offering it, slow as saints handing out blessings. And at mailbox number 4218, a man in denim squinted into the light as if he could weld the day into a better shape just by staring it down. Ezekiel McCall, Zeke to anybody who'd earned the right, stood with a socket wrench in his palm and a smear of axle grease like war paint at the heel of his thumb. Tightening the last carriage bolt on a mailbox, he restored the way some folks restore memories. Carefully, with more patience than anybody thinks they have. The box itself wasn't fancy. Cast iron rescued from a junk pile, sandblasted clean, primed and painted the deep. Midnight blue his late wife Ada had always favored. The lids raised letters polished to a quiet shine, and a flag of proud little red you couldn't ignore. He'd scrolled him in the corner, Ada McCall, using a jeweler's graver in his best Sunday steadiness. And when the bolt finally cinched tight, he gave the post a testing shake, solid, but kinder than it looked, the way he tried to be. The road hummed with dragonflies and far-off cattle, and Zeke could hear the soft metallic breathing of his welder cooling in the barn, still ticking from the brackets he'd just welded under the box to keep the lid from rattling when the panhandle wind got uppity. He stepped back, wiped his hands on a rag that had seen more years than some men's patience, and let himself smile, small, private, the way men do when they're sharing it with someone who isn't there. This was the third mailbox he'd put up since Easter, and he'd promised himself this one would last because Ada hated waste, and because there was a particular cruelty to replacing the thing your neighbors use to speak kindness into your life. A dust plume crested the ridge like a bad idea, tires whispering on tar, and the black and white Charger belonging to the Green Hollow States Property Association. HOA security. Decals designed to look exactly like the county's cruisers to anybody glancing through worry, came yawing around a bend with exactly as much respect for the speed limit as a bar brag. Zeke felt his jaw tighten, the way a horse tightens to a jerk rein. It was Brent driving, square head, mirrored sunglasses, a stomach that told on him when he tried to stand arrogant, and his partner Kyle riding shotgun, elbow out the window like a dare to the sunlight. They'd taken to sweeping the county's shoulder here as if the HOA boundary fence reached out into public road by sheer force of entitlement, and they'd accidentally clipped Zeke's old box twice now with their push bar, calling it traffic calming in there. Reports, laughing about code compliance to his face like the words could cover cheap bullying. Brent braked just enough to make the car dip in a theatrical nod, flashed a red and blue light bar once, a toddler's tantrum of authority, and let the Charger's passenger side mirror flirt with Zeke's new paint as a hiss by, "Get a real mailbox, old man." It wasn't just about steel and bolts anymore. This was about the way those boys in their almost cop costumes had enjoyed looking at him like a problem to be fixed instead of a neighbor to be respected. This was about the way the HOA chair had smiled, thin as a fence wire, and told him the board would review the incident, while everyone understood that meant watch nothing and do less. Zeke thumbed his phone awake and opened the email thread where Marisol had answered his questions with a clean certainty full stop. And he could hear her voice in those two words, dry as good gin. He built the last post stout, oak sleeve and steel, but he built it to the temper of his temper, not to the letter of the law. This time he would do both. He hauled a bag of secrete with the ease of long practice, marked the hole with white spray paint, and set the auger spinning into the earth until the smell of damp clay came up like news. The wind stroked the pasture, and a morning dove stitched its plain song across the fence line while he set rebar in a triangle and slid a galvanized sleeve through it. A breakaway design he'd sketched on a napkin and then driven into town to show Marisol, like a kid bringing a drawing to a teacher he wants to impress. As long as the outer post shears of the sleeve under impact and the core isn't a hazard, you're golden, she'd said, tapping the sketch. Just don't build a guillotine, and he'd promised he wouldn't. He mixed the concrete until it slumped like thick batter. Set. The inner core plumb with his torpedo level, and tamped the world back around it. By the time the sun dipped, a steel spine hid in that earth. Perfectly legal, perfectly patient, with a sacrificial cedar post sleeved over it that looked like it would surrender a hard stare. Ada would have laughed at the trick. Gentle to the eye, stubborn at the bone, Zeke wiped sweat with the back of his arm, drank from the spigot until his teeth ached with cold, and glanced down the road where the blacktop ran. Like a dare toward evening. Across the fence, calves butted each other's ribs in the language of summer, and a hawk wrote its initials in the sky. There was peace here if he left it alone, but the last month had taught him something he'd avoided learning since Ada died, that some folks only understand the kind of quiet that follows consequence. He locked the barn, whistled for Blue. The old healer's hips complained, but his eyes were still high-tide bright, and the two of them stood by the new box, admiring nothing and everything. The red flag glowed like a small ember in the slant light, and Zeke thought of the letters that would come in the bills and the sympathy notes that had once come in a flood and then slowed to a trickle, and how each one traveled a long way to find the right small door. Headlights crested the ridge again, meaner this time, music thumping a taunt you couldn't hum. The Charger slid into view with its push bar, wearing old bugs like trophies. Brent tapped the siren. Twice. Whoop, whoop. A child swinging at a horn he didn't deserve, and let the car drift lazy toward the shoulder, the way a bully drifts toward your lunch tray. Zeke didn't move. The Charger's tire kissed gravel, then tar again. Brent grinned in Zeke's rearview memory. Cal tossed a fast food cup that arced and tumbled into the ditch. Blue flinched at the insult, and as they ghosted past this time, Brent mouthed, exaggerated, soon, like a man planning a fireworks show. Zeke's eyelid twitched the way a welder does when someone strikes an arc behind him without warning. He flipped the flag down again because repetition is a kind of prayer, and when the taillights finally dwindled, he exhaled and let the quiet close up the road like a healed cut. The mailbox didn't look like much, just a box on a post at the edge of the world. But there was a secret in its bones now, a legality as clean as a whetstone, and somewhere between the sleeve and the steel and the unread county emails lay a promise. The next time somebody tried to make their fun out here, the ground itself was going to teach. Zeke patted the cedar face the way you pat a horse that's learned a new trick, tipped his hat to the dark as if we're an old friend rolling up the lane, and went inside to set coffee for morning, a man who had chosen patience and prepared consequence. Both. Because out where the road forgets your name, you learn to write it yourself in something that lasts. The next week wore itself thin with petty harassments. Letters folded in officious fonts accusing Zeke of unauthorized modifications. HOA board members driving slow past his fence line like buzzards sniffing a carcass. Even Brent and Kyle pulling their cruiser up just far enough to aim the spotlight through his bedroom window at 2 a.m. But Zeke met every poke with the same response. Silence, documentation, and the steady tick of his welder cooling down after another long evening in the barn. He filed each notice in a binder labeled nonsense and highlighted the county right-of-way statutes until the yellow streaks glowed like a beacon, and when Marisol Vega from zoning stopped by on her lunch hour with sweet tea and foam cup, she walked the post with him, tape measure snapping, nodding at every number, finally saying with a grin, "You built this prettier than the book itself. Don't let them bluff you." Brent, meanwhile, puffed himself up on the neighborhood app, boasting that, old man, Zeke's new box wouldn't last a week, bragging about how they'd baptize it proper with the Charger's bumper. Kyle egged him on, screen captured by neighbors who were beginning to tire of the spectacle, muttering that the HOA security was looking more like a circus. On a storm-wet Friday night, their chance came. Rain hissing off the asphalt, ditches swollen, and Brent itching for his show. He downshifted hard, laughing with Kyle as he lined the push bar with the mailbox flag. Tires screaming. Water and rooster tails, headlights cutting through mist, and then impact. Only the sound wasn't the satisfying crunch he'd imagined, but a shriek of tortured steel and the abrupt whump of airbags detonating in their faces. The Charger's nose crumpled like paper against a post that didn't budge an inch, its unfolding, fluids bleeding onto the road, the mailbox standing proud and calm as a preacher on Sunday morning. Brent reeled, ears ringing, face powdered with airbag dust, while Kyle clawed at the radio, trying to shout, "Officer attacked," though the words slurred through his panic. But from porches and pickup trucks the neighbors were already there, phones recording, laughter mixing with outrage as they shouted, "You did that yourselves!" And all on video. One kid even narrating live on Instagram. Zeke, hearing the thud, walked slow from the barn with Blue at his side, denim darkened by the drizzle, hat brim throwing off beads of water, his expression not triumphant, but tired as if he'd always known the lesson would arrive this way. Deputy Rhodes rolled up next, lights flickering red against the wreckage, stepping out calm, taking one long look before saying, "Reckless driving." destruction of property, impersonation charges stacking up. Brent tried to bluster. He built a death trap. But Marisol's county truck pulled him behind the deputy, her clipboard already open, and she measured depth, checked the sleeve, tapped the county seal on the permit with her pen, and said, "This mailbox is by the book." Zeke stood with his hands on his hips, rain slicking his jacket, and looked at the ruined cruiser nose into the cedar post that hadn't even splintered, then at the mailbox flag still upright, red against the storm. His voice was low, steady, carrying anyway. "Told you, boys, you messed with the wrong one." And though he didn't raise it, the words landed louder than any siren, echoing off the wet blacktop into the courthouse, smelled faintly of wax floors and paper dust, the kind of air that remembers arguments better than laughter. And into that space shuffled Brent and Kyle in borrowed suits that fit about as well as their fake badges ever had, faces blotched from sun and shame, their eyes scanning for allies and finding only spectators with folded arms and camera phones ready. Zeke sat near the front in his best denim jacket, hat respectfully in his lap, calm as a river stone, with Marisol Vega beside him and a thick folder of county specs balanced on her knees like scripture. Judge Albright entered with a gait that announced he was allergic to nonsense, his gavel cracking once and making the murmur die like a blown candle, and the prosecutor wasted no time, projecting videos onto the screen. The Charger's headlights slicing rain, the grins of Brent and Kyle seconds before disaster, the sudden crunch as steel met legality and lost, followed by the neighbors' whoops and laughter ringing like bells of justice. The defense squirmed, stammering about unsafe construction and malicious intent. But Marisol rose with her clipboard, pointing to stamped permits, photographs of the breakaway sleeve, measurements down to the inch, her voice steady as she read line by line, compliant with Section 42.13 of the County Road Standards. Use of suggested materials. As needed, depth and clearance. This mailbox is not a trap. The law requires this mailbox. The gallery erupted in murmurs, some clapping until the judge's raised eyebrow pressed them back into silence. Deputy Rhodes testified next, explaining how the HOA cruiser had no legal jurisdiction beyond private property, how its decals violated state code, how its insurance didn't even cover off-site travel. With every sentence, Brent's shoulders sagged further, Kyle twisting his tie like it might strangle him first. The twist sharpened when the prosecutor called the state licensing board's representative, who declared flatly that their security unit wasn't registered, certified, or recognized. These men were playing dress-up in patrol car they had no right to operate. A woman in the back gasped, "All that bluster for nothing," while another mumbled, "They nearly killed someone over mailbox." Brent tried to yell he baited us, as gasps spread across the benches. But the judge's gavel struck like thunder, silencing him as Albright leaned forward, his voice ablade. "You impersonated officers. You put citizens in danger. Until the law reminded you that it does not mock back, you mocked the law." Zeke, arms crossed across his chest, finally let himself breathe deeply. The kind of breath a man takes when the storm he welded into steel has done its work, and the truth is louder than any engine. By the time the charges were read, reckless driving, impersonation, destruction of property, and misuse of emergency lights, the men looked less like officers and more like boys caught with stolen toys. Judge Albright returned from a brief recess with the kind of weary resolve that comes from having watched too many small men dress themselves in big authority. And when he spoke, the room leaned forward as one, no theatrics, no throat clearing, just a clean edge of consequence. This court finds the defendants guilty of reckless driving, criminal impersonation of a peace officer, unlawful use of emergency equipment, and destruction of property. He said, "Each count plays like a rivet in steel," and before the defense could groan or posture, he went on, "Your security unit is dissolved by injunction effective immediately. The HOA is fined for sponsoring unlicensed enforcement and is ordered to reimburse Mr. McCall for all losses, including the first 2 mailboxes you destroyed, court fees, and damages. Furthermore, the board will post, for no fewer than 90 days, a notice at every entrance stating that HOA personnel are not law enforcement and possess no police powers beyond private property." A murmur swelled, half relief, half vindication, until the gavel tapped once and pushed it down. Albright turned his gaze toward a gallery where the HOA board president sat, shrinking into his blazer and Added, and to ensure this lesson sticks, this court orders community training with the county on jurisdiction and de-escalation, attendance mandatory for all board members. Failure to comply will result in additional sanctions. Brent's jaw jutted out, a last weak bluff, but the bailiff's hand on his shoulder replaced bluster with swallow, and Kyle stared at the table as though it might suddenly open and grant him a trapdoor. When the judge asked if the victim wished to speak, Zeke stood, removed his hat like a man stepping into a church, and let his hands rest on the back of the bench in front of him. His voice was plain as fence posts, steady as the panhandle wind. I'm not asking for anything fancy. I just want to be left alone to work my land, to get my mail, and to remember my wife without somebody taking sport at my expense. That box was built to last, not to hurt nobody. To last. The judge nodded. There was nothing left to add, and as the bailiff led Brent and Kyle away to processing, their cuffs whispering against their borrowed suit coats, the neighbors in the back row finally let themselves exhale into soft applause, the kind that slips out when people feel the world click half a notch closer to level. Outside, on the courthouse steps, microphones gathered like flies around the HOA board president until Marisol Vega stepped into frame, county seal on her, clipboard catching the light, and answered the only question that mattered with bureaucratic poetry that sounded like a benediction. The statute is clear. The shoulder is county. The mailbox is compliant. The harassment stops now. And Deputy Rhodes, hat tipped low, added, and the light bar goes back to the catalog you bought it from. By evening, the injunction papers were nailed to the clubhouse bulletin board with blue pushpin that looked suddenly regal, the HOA's operations unit logo. Peeled from the door with a long, embarrassing squeal of vinyl and a volunteer crew. Some who'd filmed, some who'd cheered, some who'd been afraid to do either, organized a Saturday workday to repair what ego had broken. That Saturday dawned with a forgiving sky and a breeze that smelled like cut hay. Folks showed up with post-hole diggers, brush loppers, casseroles, and a cooler full of iced tea. Zeke hauled out spare cedar rails, and together they mended a section of fence the HOA had, threatened to fine him for, then walked 2 houses down to Mrs. Betty Lou's place. She'd been a quiet target, too, her mailbox flattened twice with no one to call. And they set a twin to Zeke's design in her ditch, Marisol measuring with conspirators' grin and pronouncing, perfectly boring and perfectly legal, which might be the highest praise a county inspector can give. Kids painted little blue bonnets on the outer cedar sleeves. Someone planted crepe myrtles along the shoulder, and the neighborhood app, once a theater for taunts, filled with photos of sunburned smiles, foil-covered pies, and a caption from a teenager who'd filmed the crash. We decided to be neighbors today. Even Rhodes rolled by slow in his county cruiser, 2 fingers lifted from the wheel in a piece that looked like promise, and when he parked and took a paper plate, someone yelled, "Deputy, you on potato salad detail or security?" And he chewed, considered, and said, "I'm on let folks be detail," which earned more laughter than the HOA had managed a year. As the sun tipped toward evening, Zeke carried a small brass plaque from the barn, thumb rubbing the edge as if to warm the letters before the world saw them, and knelt at the base of his post. Blue flopped in the grass with a satisfied old dog grunt, and the murmurs around him hushed the way people hush at weddings and funerals and the moments that feel like both. Zeke set 2 pilot holes, drove the screws with a firm patience you reserve for sentences you want remembered, and stepped back. The plaque caught the last light and read, "For Ada, built to last." Nobody clapped. They didn't need to. The wind handled the honoring, running its hand over the new crepe myrtles and the cedar sleeves and the blue enamel letters on the box like a prayer that didn't need words. Later, when the crowd thinned and the road returned to its long patience, Zeke walked the fence line in the violet hour, the way he had every night since Ada passed, boots whispering through buffalo grass, cicadas tuning their evening saws. At the shoulder he paused, set the red flag to its resting place, and listened. No sirens, no cruel whoop of a toy light bar, only the far-off chuckle of a windmill and cattle talking themselves into sleep. He thought about how strength is so often confused for spite, and how the truest kind, Ada's kind, sat quiet beneath the surface where it could hold something up without making a show of it. On his way back, he found Marisol and Rhodes leaning on his tailgate, finishing the last of the tea, their faces unguarded in the soft light. "You could have taken the settlement with a gag order," Marisol said, not a question. Zeke shook his head. "Ada liked folks to learn," he answered, and the 3 of them watched the hawk draw a dark tilt across the sky. They learned, Rhodes said, and tipped two fingers again. The headlines ran their cycle. Unlicensed HOA cops crash into legal mailbox. Judge dissolves rogue security unit. Rancher wins case. Community rebuilds. Then slip beneath whatever the next storm was. But in Dry Creek County, the story kept working like rain sinking into hard ground. Board meetings turned practical neighbors. Knocked before they complained, and a teenager with a toolbox started a summer business, installing county-compliant posts because he figured the world needed more quiet victories. Months later, a fresh coat of paint on the blue enamel made the box wink at sunrise, and Zeke, coffee steaming in the porch shade, watched the mail truck ease up, the carrier giving a cheerful honk like a blessing. Letters slid into the dark and landed with the soft dignity of something delivered, and Zeke thought, not, for the first time, that a mailbox is just a little door where the world remembers your name. He palmed the plaque, felt the warmth the metal had stolen from the sun, and smiled that same small, private smile he'd smiled the day he set the first bolt. The road stretched away, straight and honest, and if once in a while a shiny sedan slowed to read the words for Ada, built to last, well, that was all right. Some lessons are better when you take them slow. Behind him, the welder sat quiet, dust, settling on its case like a soft amen. And ahead the evening unrolled itself without hurry, a long ribbon of peace tied at last around a post that hadn't just defeated a bully. It had anchored a neighborhood back to itself.